You have a seat.
The week before spring break, I had the opportunity to get back in the schools and mentor. We got a ton of mentors here at Foundation. It's one of the heartbeats of what we do in the community. And I had the opportunity to go check out and spend some time with my 7th grade student that's at Smoky Road Middle School. And I got there, and it was just kind of one of those moments where I just kind of felt like it was going to kind of be an off day, right? For those of you that have mentored, you kind of know what I'm talking about. You know, you just don't know what you're going to step into sometimes. And this kid I've been with since he's been in 3rd grade. And so I got to the school, got settled in where I was going, and Maika, the site coordinator for Elevate Coweta students, came to me and was like, Jason, I don't think y'all are going to be able to hang out today. I was like, why? And she said, well, he's got to go make up some classwork during lunch. And then the next thing I know, he brings his little plastic tray into the office and sits down for a second, tells me what he's going to do for spring break. He's like, man, I got to go. I gotta go do some classwork. And I'm on him. I've been on him since 3rd grade to do his schoolwork. So I had to go, all right, well, see you in 2 weeks. And during spring break, get your work done, right? And so then I drove down here, and I was trying to mentor back to back. I drove down here to see my 3rd grade kid, and I'm walking in the hall, and I walk down to the cafeteria, and right by the double doors where we first come in, and I walk by the cafeteria, and their class isn't in there, and I'm like, uh-oh, something just happened. And with that class, if something happened, it was probably with my kid. And so that's just what I knew. And so I walked in, and I didn't see him, and so I walked back down the hallway, and in that transition, I walked past my student, another student, and his teacher, again, with their plastic little lunch trays, headed back to a classroom. But this time, the teacher saw me and knew me and said, hey, he's in trouble, he's in silent lunch, but you're here, he needs you, go back to the cafeteria, y'all have a conversation. And so, of course, that conversation, we're having that conversation. I was like, man, why in the world are you carrying your lunch tray the opposite direction? And he said, well, I got silent lunch. I said, well, why do you have silent lunch? He's like, well, it's the other kid's fault. And I was like, of course. Okay, really, why do you have silent lunch? Like, you had no role in the fact that there were 2 kids carrying, or you were just like wrongly accused of having silent lunch? And then we kind of unwrapped what was actually going on, and it was kind of one of those moments that I have with my 3 kids. They're 15, 12, and 9. When they have some of those moments, right? They have some of those moments. We sat down and we're walking through this, and I told him, I was like, man, what you did, it doesn't sound bad, but how you reacted to it. And then he stopped and he said, I know, I can control how I react to things. He's like, yeah. I can do this. I can control it. And so I had a moment there to sit and spend some time and reflect on how and why we make decisions. You know, and I went into it with him. I said, hey, often we make bad decisions because bad decisions don't require as much work, right? Good decisions often require heavy lifting. Good decisions often require a little bit more work. And sometimes we just don't like to work. So the easier thing in his situation was to act out towards the other student, cause a disruption, have silent lunch, instead of ignoring the situation or stepping into it and making it a different situation, right? And so that's where I think a lot of us, me included, find ourselves sometimes. We know that good decisions will require heavy lifting. The good decisions will require a little bit more work on our end. So maybe subconsciously, I don't think anybody wakes up and says, hey, I'm going to make a ton of awful decisions today. But the reality is we know that there's a little less resistance on the bad decision side of things. You know, last week, as Clint said, Adam started a series called Lucky to Be Alive. And in that, he talked a little bit about the Pharisees and how the Pharisees caught Jesus doing work on the Sabbath and caught his disciples doing some things and doing some things that they shouldn't do. And this tension was created, right? This tension was created. It kind of started there of this journey that Jesus was on with his followers, that was just a little bit different than the establishment was. He was teaching things that were new and a little bit of spin on what they've heard in the past. And so the disciples were learning and relearning how to make those better choices and decisions. And Adam did a great job last week describing the tension between the religious elite of the day, the Pharisees, and Jesus and his disciples. The Pharisees were faced with big choices of allowing Jesus to continue to teach, heal, and influence the people that they were supposed to be leading, or to continue with their regulations and agenda. The Pharisees were right in the middle of that tension, and they realized that Jesus was building a crowd. He was unique. He spoke with authority, and he was somebody that people were beginning to follow. And so with people who are in control, they had that decision to make. Is Jesus who we've been waiting on, or is he someone that we should be scared of? They knew right where this was headed. Last week Adam talked about it, but it was kind of the beginning of this plot to kill Jesus. And that's where we sit today. The Pharisees were at war with themselves. And I know that we probably know what that feels like. To be in the middle of what we should do and what we're going to do. Because that's what they felt. That felt like what they did was what they should have done. They were stuck in this tension. They were at war with themselves. This morning, we're going to kind of pick up where Adam left off last week in the book of Matthew, just a few chapters later. Matthew was one of those guys that followed Jesus. Matthew was a tax collector. In those days, tax collectors were considered some of the chief sinners in the community, right? But Jesus chose Matthew, called Matthew out. It's a really cool story in the front end of the book of Matthew. But he asked Matthew to journey with him. And Matthew's the guy that writes this down as an eyewitness account of actually what happens. The song that we just sang and what we walked through with singing Hosanna, as Jess mentioned, was just a couple days before this in that last week of Jesus' life. So just a couple days before that, they're celebrating Jesus coming in. And then we get to the moment that we're talking about today, where in a series of teaching, Jesus tells these two stories that at first glance don't really go together. But the heart and the meaning behind these stories, sometimes called parables, do in fact go together really well. I've always looked at this section of teaching as some of the most important words of Jesus because he's walking to his death. He's walking to the cross. He's walking to his purpose. He's walking to why he came. And he has the wherewithal and the ability to stop that walk to teach some very important things to his guys and to the building crowd that's around it. And I really think the Pharisees were on the edges of that crowd too, listening. So we're going to jump to Matthew 25, and we're going to start with verse 14. And I'm going to throw a lot of scripture out today, but there's some main points that I want to connect from last week to what we're walking to with Good Friday and Easter. And verse 14 says this: "Again, it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them. To one, he gave 5 bags of gold, to another, 2 bags, and to another, 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey." Now, you may have heard this story before. You might not recognize it immediately if you've been in church for a little while. In previous times I've taught this, the way that I've described these bags of gold is with the word talent. The word talent is the word that that unfortunately we get today as our word in English, talent. It came from the same Greek word. But the meaning that that word talent has today in our culture is very different than the meaning that it had in the first century. And so as they've revised some of the versions of Scripture, they decided that bags of gold better reflected exactly what was going on here. They got these bags of gold, and these servants, man, these servants got a ton of money in these bags of gold. I can't overemphasize this enough. One of these bags of gold, just one, was worth 16 and a half years of a normal person's wages, or 6,000 denarius in each bag. It was just a unit of measurement back in the day. It's how they counted money, with the word denarius. It's like our dollar. So there's a lot of money in these bags. But the thing that I want everybody to catch here, and I don't want to get hung up on exactly, what's going on with the talents and the bags of gold and the denarius and the 6,000 and the 16 and a half years' wages. Those are all important details. But the crucial thing to realize here is the master gave to each servant according to their ability. Now, Jesus is using the word ability here to signify, again, something a little bit differently than we hear when we hear the English word today, ability. The root of this word in the original language actually is where we get the English word dynamite. So the word picture that's here is that there's this power in the servants to do what's right with what they've been given. There's this power underneath it. The servants were given bags of gold based on their uniqueness and their power and their gifts. None of these servants had the same ability, story, genetics, heart, anything. There were three very different people given three very different things. Verse 16. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once to put his money to work and gained 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who received the 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Now I want to stop there. The first 2 servants, man, they got to work. They got to work. Mainly, they probably got to work because it was their master's money. I'm not really good with math, but if you multiply 5 times 16 years of salary, that's a lot of money, right? So if any of you, after we're done, I'll be at the blue tent. If you have a bag of gold that's worth that much, I will take it, and I will use it, and I will invest it, and man, your money will go a long way, and then we'll bring it back. You'll go away for a little while, and we'll bring it back, and I'll give it to you. And I may give all of it to you, but that's what's going on. They're given this money, and I would imagine it was probably something they were expecting because they knew that their master was going away, right? And so they did something with the money. They got to work, they knew the right choice, and they did the hard work. And then the third servant we see here does something completely baffling to me. He takes 16 and a half years of wages in a bag and goes to a field and buries the money. That just doesn't make any sense at all. But I think I understand why Jesus was getting to that point. We'll uncover that in a second. But he takes that bag of gold and immediately makes the wrong decision to go find a shovel, to go to a field, to dig a hole, to put the bag in the hole, cover it back up, and then leave. Now, if I were the first or the second servant, I would have been watching what he was doing to go get that extra bag and surprise my master even more, and then he wouldn't have had the bag to bring back when they all had to, settle accounts, right? That's what I would have done. So don't, I guess that's bad. Don't hide money around me. I would probably, I don't know. Verse 19. After a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who had received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5 back. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. His master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. Verse 22. The man with 2 bags also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. Verse 23, his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things, and I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. There's a couple things that jump out to me in this portion of the text. And I don't know if these 2 servants got together, they just kind of huddled over to the side and was like, hey, we're going to use the same language and we're going to say the same things. But I think it's probably because Jesus was trying to make a very relevant point. They use the word entrusted. Now that word carries a lot of meaning. They use the word entrusted. See, they had this understanding that the bag of gold, all their bags of gold that they had received, were not theirs. They weren't. They weren't theirs. They belonged to the master. It was theirs. He owned it, right? They understood that they were to give it back. They understood they were to give it all back. The word entrusted is huge here. When we use the word here and today in our culture, it's simply about taking care of something, usually something very important for someone. You know, you might babysit kids. You're entrusted those kids, right? They're somebody else's kids. They're not your kids, but they trust you to take care of them. House sitting, dog sitting, taking somebody's money, being an investor for something or investing in something. It's something that happens in our culture and time all the time. They were trusted, and they did something with it. Because of their action, did you catch what they were called? Good and faithful. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I know that when I think about those 2 words, good and faithful, I would love to be described that way. Man, and if that's the only way I was described, man, that'd be a great way to be described. When the first time somebody thinks about you or mentions your name, if that's what they think about, it's pretty incredible. But they were given different amounts of money. They were given a different amount. And they both made a different amount back for their master. But they were both called the same thing. The master didn't call the 5-bag guy something better. He didn't call the 2-bag guy something worse. It was equal. I think that's something to hold on to. We'll come back in a second. Verse 24. This is what happens with the 3rd guy. Then the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. Verse 25. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See here what belongs to you. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. You knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the bankers so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. Now, this one's tough. This one's tough. But what it comes down to is, like I said before, he took the wrong action, made the wrong decision, and buried the bag of gold in the ground. And the master was coming back expecting a return on his money, and he didn't get the return on his money. In fact, he got a small little lecture from the servant telling him who he was, telling him where he had failed. This is interesting here. Because of his inaction. Because remember, the master gave the servants everything they needed based on their ability. The master would not have called this guy to him to handle this money if he didn't think that he could have done something with it. Because of this inaction, this bad decision, he was called wicked and lazy. Now, I would love to be called good and faithful, but I don't ever want anybody to say anything like wicked and lazy attached to me. In fact, that's why kind of how I'm wired. That's why I don't like to rest, because I don't want to be called lazy. These words hurt. And we're not going to read it, but just as it kind of unfurls, like what happens is the master takes back the bag and gives it to the first servant. He could have had that bag. But he decided that putting a hole in the ground and putting money in it was more important. But kind of what this boils down to is a couple simple phrases. The first one is this: faithfulness requires a risk. Even if it's somebody else's stuff, right? It requires a risk. When we come to believing who Jesus is, maybe we've not been in church. Maybe we've been outside of the church for quite some time. Maybe we've been hurt by the church in the past. And we come to the point where we realize who Jesus is and what he's done for us, and we put our faith and trust in him. It brings us to this point. Now, it's not a risk in placing our faith in who Jesus is, because he's going to come through. Always does. The risk involved is doing something with what God has given you. The second statement kind of goes along with it, that faithfulness requires that same risk over and over and over again. Every day. Every day that my foot hits the ground, my faith grows when I take a risk. I become that good and faithful servant when I take a risk. You see, here's the thing. We get hung up in the comparison game or the risk aversion game, or we look at the guy that got 5 bags, like, man, why didn't I get 5? Why did I just get 2? Or, you're the person that got 1 bag and, you're just comparing yourself, right? Or, like the third servant, you just don't want to take a risk. You're scared to jump out in faith and do something with what you've been given. Now, Jesus is simply illustrating here, and this is crazy to me because he is, again, like I said earlier, he's walking towards his death. He knows that his death is coming. It's literally a weekend, like it's a couple days away. It's one festival away. It's just Passover. He knows that it's coming to an end, and he's talking to people that he loves about how to take what he is about to give them and use it the best way they can. And Jesus is simply illustrating that our life that we have is not actually ours anyway. And here's honestly where the rubber meets the road. Because a lot of us are independent, and it's our life, and we want it. We want to do with it what we please at our timing. But when we jump into that relationship with Jesus, there's this understanding that he has entrusted us, our life, our bodies, our finances, our gifts, our abilities. He has entrusted us to do something with them. Not for us, but for him. I got stuck in this tension a while back. Prior to Foundation, I led a college ministry at the University of West Georgia. And man, for a long time, we were like the fastest growing ministry around. And I didn't even know why. Like, I thought it was because of me. It wasn't. I figured that out quickly. But I got caught in that comparison deal. I wanted to be like the other ministries that I knew of. And for me, it was the number of people in the seats every week. That for some reason, that meant that I was better or worse at my job, was the number of kids that, college kids of all people, like, the only thing they're consistent at being is inconsistent. Love you, college students. But that's where I was stuck. I was stuck on taking what I was given and building my own little kingdom in a little tiny 5-acre plot of land in Carrollton, Georgia. And I remember one particular night like it was yesterday. One of my former students, he interned with me too. He came back from a mission deal that he was doing for a year. And he came back and he sat in my office after one of our gatherings and he said, "How are you?" And I started to explain all of these things. And it was just all about numbers and all about people and all about money and all about growth and all of those things. And he looked at me, and I'll never forget this. He looked at me and he said, "Jason, God doesn't call you to be successful. He calls you to be faithful. And there's a difference between the two." This week I got to take my oldest son on a road trip, which was pretty cool, and I actually ran into this guy. He's still doing mission work, and we connected on the way back. And I can't, think that was a coincidence, right? God lined us up this week so that I could be reminded of that. Now, if we scan down the page a little bit, still in chapter 25, we see the story where a shepherd brings sheep and goats to a king. And the king separates the goats on his left and the sheep on his right. Verse 34 gets into the story, and we'll pick it up right there. Verse 34, it says, "The king will say to those on his right, the sheep, 'Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me.'" And in verse 37 comes an incredible question from the group to his right. And I think this ties in, and I don't want to blend the stories too much, but I think this ties into what we just walked through with the bags of gold, with the good servants, with the wise servants. That they would have probably been the people over to the right. But in verse 37 of Matthew 25, Jesus says this, "Then the righteous will answer him, 'Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink?' Verse 38, 'When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go visit you?' Verse 40, the king will reply, 'Truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me.'" Now, I think this was an honest, legitimate question from the sheep, from the group of people that have been, in this story, classified as sheep. They didn't realize the good that they had done. They didn't realize that the work that they were doing with the life that they've been trusted to bring back a reward. I think this is a look into the heart of a sheep in Matthew 25. There's a lot that we could talk about with this story, but what it comes down to is this. The sheep are the you belong here type of people. They go to whatever length necessary to clothe, to provide food, to visit, to make people feel welcome, whole, at home with them. To me, this story we just briefly went over is a story of belonging. It's a story of compassion. It's an extension, really, of what Jesus was just talking about with the servants. I imagine those servants would be those type of people. And then we go down a little bit further. This won't be on the screen, but in verse 41 through 43, Jesus talks to the people, or the king in the story talks to the people on the left. He says, "Depart from me, you who are cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, and you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you did not look after me." Verse 44. This is their response. They also will answer, "Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty or a stranger or needing clothes or sick and in prison and did not help you?" Verse 45. He will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did not do for one of the least of these, you did not do for me." Now, like the story of the gold bags before this one, man, this is all about faithfulness. It's all about taking a risk. It's all about faithfulness. But the little spin of it here is that it's faithfulness leading to action. But it's not just faithfulness leading to action, it's faithfulness leading to compassion, which is a whole different way to live. Now, here's a good working definition of compassion, because I think we throw this word around quite a bit. But here's what it means. It's a noun. And the first definition of compassion is simply this. It's a deep awareness of and sympathy for another's suffering. The second definition, I really like this one. It gets to the heart of what Jesus is talking about here. It's the humane quality of understanding the suffering of others and wanting to do something about it. Now, the sheep in this story were the ones that saw the needs of others and did the best that they could do to meet them. See a need, meet a need. They're those kind of people. Now, before I push into this a little further, I know there's some of you in here that just brings up all sorts of anxiety because you see so many things that are wrong in this world. You see it all the time. Your eyes are open. You can't go a day without seeing it. Join the club. I'm like the poster child. You don't have to hit all 100% of the time. There's nothing in there that says you got to do it all the time. But you just got to do it. See, if you believe in what Jesus did for you, then that should push us, propel us to compassion for other people. Jesus, like Adam talked about last week, he talked about how Jesus desires his people, his followers, to be people of mercy. Jesus desires his people, his followers, to be people, not only of faith, but of compassion. Faithfulness leads to compassion. Now, as we wrap up here, I want to kind of share another scripture that I'm going to read really quickly. If you flip the page over to Matthew chapter 26, in the first 5 verses, you read this. When Jesus had finished saying all of these things, he said to his disciples, "As you know, the Passover is just 2 days away, and the Son of Man," meaning himself, "will be handed over to be crucified." Verse 3. Then the chief priest and the elders and the people assembled in the palace of the high priest Caiaphas. They schemed to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him, but not during the festival, so that they wouldn't cause a riot. So in the literal sense here, Jesus was truly lucky to be alive at this point. The Pharisees were plotting his death. Everything was lining up for this final, scene, so to speak. Jesus was starting to resonate with the people, and at this point, he was beginning to captivate the minds of the people. Jesus' actions, followed by his teachings, had built this tension that we honestly still sit in today. The religious leaders of that day felt threatened. Jesus was building a following, and they knew that they needed to be building the case that Jesus was crazy and that he needed to die. Honestly, at this point, Jesus was truly lucky to be alive. So this is where the rubber meets the road for all of us. The servants in the first parable that took what was entrusted to them by the master and built something from it were called good and faithful. The sheep in the second story that had the heart the king commended, they didn't even realize it. Like I said, Jesus was a couple days shy of his death. And he went to the cross not for him, but for other people around him. He went to the cross not for him, but for other people to have a way to God. He went to the cross not for him, but for the world. Not only the world then, but the world since and the world forever. When I look at these words of Jesus, I think there's two strong next steps for us to all consider today. First one is this: we're alive to be faithful. We're alive, we're made alive, and we're followers of Jesus. We're made new. We're made new to pursue this faith. And it's an active faith that's all about putting to work what we've been entrusted with. And you might be saying, okay, well, Jason, what does that mean? What in the world does that mean? Okay, look, be the sheep. See the needs and start to meet them. Be the servants that take what you've been entrusted with and build on it. You might be saying, that's it. Okay, I get that. I understand that. But how do I do that? Here's what you do. This week, start at home. Look at the people that you live with. Your spouse, your kids, your roommate. Maybe even extend that to the people you go to school with and the people you work with. See the needs and try to meet those needs. Slow down this week, because there's going to be some things that come for you, just like they'll come for me. And number two, and this is the only way to say it, there are people that are only going to hear about Jesus because of you. That's it. And that's so crazy to me that the people, and it's not from a stage, it's from doing life with people and being challenged to bring them along. And we have that opportunity this week with our Good Friday event on the square. Make it a date night. Invite somebody along. Help them to see the same thing that you've seen. Faithfulness requires a risk. Faithfulness leads to compassion. And we're alive to be faithful.